Unpack. So welcome to class 4. Last week we jumped into the Noahic Covenant after kind of reviewing some things with some explanation of Canon. All right, and the Canon is what surrounds the covenant, and we learned about how the Bible, if it's God's written record of his covenant journey with mankind, that means there's different covenants, and what surround those covenants are the canons. So we have different canons, and you weren't here last week, but that video will be up on YouTube pretty soon so you can get a capture of it. So we're going to continue on with the Abrahamic covenant, which is really, really cool. There's a lot of stuff, and again, since this is not just a description of covenants and how to look at things through covenant lenses, but this is also, in a way, a little mini scaled down Old Testament survey. So we are going to be reading some nice scripture verses today and doing some, looking at some stories and some things that happened with Abraham. I want to make sure that I don't leave, though, because we were rushed towards the end of last week, and I kind of just threw some stuff at you right before we left, and I didn't finalize with the Noahic covenant. So that's the first covenant, Noah, the Noahic covenant. And I just want to make sure that we do understand that when God makes a covenant, usually there is a promise that is attached to it. So if the covenant was with Noah, come on, Chris, Noah, all right? The promise was what? What was the promise that God made with Noah? You never destroy the earth with a flood. Never destroy via flood. So that was the promise. Now, that was a really big deal to think about it, right? Because prior to the flood, many scholars, many Hebrew scholars specifically, will say it had never rained before. That the dew came up and watered the plants, watered the crops. This was the first time rain had come. So the first time rain comes, what happens? The world is destroyed. The earth is destroyed. So now what's going to be in their minds the next time it starts to rain? So see, to us, from our perspective, we don't think like that. We rejoice when it rains, unless it's been raining too much, right? But we rejoice when it rains. It's good for the crops. My grass is loving the rain right now. It's nice and green and lush, and it makes me need to cut it every 5 days instead of every 8 days, but still, it's nice and lush. But for them, without this promise, there could have been a lot of fear that could have crept into mankind because of the rains, waters that were coming down. So you have a covenant, you have Noah as their first covenant, and then the promise to Noah was to never destroy via flood. And what usually accompanies the promise for the covenant is the sign of the covenant, which was a rainbow. So this was just the one last thing that I didn't get a chance to make sure that you saw, but when a covenant was made, typically, you would have a promise, and then you would have a sign of the covenant. So the rainbow is the sign of the covenant, so that every time it rains and we see a rainbow, we know that God is not full of wrath, right? We learned that last week, that there was no wrath over the flood, that the word specifically says that God was grieved at the wickedness of mankind, and he relented upon even creating humanity in the first place, but he found faith in Noah and decided to kind of do a restart. But there was no wrath. He didn't, full of wrath, descend upon earth and destroy it with the flood. He was grieved. And he made a promise to Noah. And then how did Noah respond? Did we remember? What was the first thing Noah did? Oh, because this is just temporary.
But we can do it underneath, so we can take a picture of it.
Okay, Sure, we could do that. Yeah, so what did Noah do? What was one of the first things he did? He got drunk. Noah got drunk. Great job, Noah. What a great way to reset. Now, here's something else that's kind of interesting, too. So we said that, we said that with Adam and Eve were given some good responsibilities, right? They were told to go forth and multiply. They're also given the charge, the responsibility, the authority to subdue the earth, right? If you read, I don't have it written down here, but if you read the charge that God gives to Noah, it is to go forth and multiply. But they are not given the authority to subdue the earth. That is specifically not listed in that charge. And it is because they didn't have the authority anymore. That authority had already been given to Satan. The keys were given to Satan because sin had entered the world. So Noah didn't have the authority to subdue the earth. He had the charge to grow forth and multiply, but not to subdue the earth, which is kind of interesting. So that's some good stuff. So the next one, the second covenant, right, is now with Abraham. Now this covenant with Abraham pretty much begins in Genesis 12. I feel like I have to open my Bible, but we'll get there in a minute. But in Genesis 12, 1-3, we have the Lord said to Abram, leave your country, your people, and your father's household, and go to the land I will show you. I will make you into a great nation, and I will bless you. I will make your name great, and you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and whoever curses you, I will curse, and all the peoples on the earth will be blessed through you. Now, contrary to what you may have heard, contrary to what you may believe, Abram was not, and in the beginning of this covenant, Abram was not told to start a new religion. Had nothing to do with forming some new Jewish faith. It has nothing to do with any of it. All that he was told to do was to go forth, and because of his faith, God was going to make him into a great nation. All right? So with Abraham, I'm going to separate this with a line. He was told to make a great nation. Or he would be a great nation. And this is interesting because you remember right before this, you had the Tower of Babel, and they wanted to make themselves great. And they were also in the east, and towards the east was in rebellion against God. So they wanted to make themselves great without God, and God struck them down. But with Abraham, he chooses Abraham. And we know that Abraham had great faith, and it was because of that faith that God said, I will make you a great nation, even though you're not asking for it. So it's kind of interesting what faith has to play with it. So God was going to make his name great. He's going to make his name great. He's going to make his nation great. And he was going to bless the entire earth. So what's kind of interesting here, this is kind of like where the journey begins. So if the canon, right, the canon of Abraham's covenant, it begins with his journey, and what ends up happening is Abram and Sarai, what do? They enter Egypt, right? And what does Abram do out of his fear of Pharaoh in regards to Sarai? He lies, right? So this is the kind of like the charge, or you could say this is an introduction to the covenant right here. This is the first time in Genesis 12 that we have this declaration. This isn't the covenant being established, but this is a foretelling. He's saying, this is what I'm going to be doing here. So then you have him going down into, so his name is Abram at the time, and you have Sarai. And what does he do? Abram lies. Okay? Now, God had just basically stated in Genesis 12, I am going to do this. He's beginning the process of establishing this covenant. So he's basically telling Abram, I've got your back. Those who bless you, I will bless. Those who curse you, I will curse. I'm going to make you a great nation, all of these great things. So then he goes down south, goes to Egypt, and he lies because he doesn't want to be killed. You would think he would be concerned about his wife, but he's more concerned about saving his own skin, I suppose. So he lies, and what ends up happening to Pharaoh? God inflicted serious diseases on Pharaoh and his entire household. All right? So he begs us to ask this question. If we make the mistake and look through this story through a Mosaic covenant of law, we know that lying is one of the 10 commandments that we were not supposed to do. So, why, when Abram lies, does God not rebuke Abram? Yes, that is exactly right. The reason is twofold. One, it's because God had made a covenant with Abram, and that covenant was one of protection. Okay? The law had not yet been given, so the standard at the time was called, you can use this, it was a standard of conscience. It's not based of rules and laws, it's a standard of conscience. There was no command not to lie, but God dealt with people based on their conscience. How do we know this? Because we can look forward. If you jump to Romans 2, what do we have in Romans 2, verse 15? I'm not used to pages. I'm used to electronic Bibles. Romans 2:15 says, since they show that the requirement of the law are written on their hearts, their consciences also bearing witness, and their thoughts now accusing, now even defending them. So Paul right there is talking about those who don't have the law. He's talking to those Gentiles that don't have the law. This standard of conscience was something that was the way that God would interact with mankind, coupled with the fact that he's got this covenant that started with Abram. So Abram, out of his conscience, thought that he was doing the right thing. He knew that God had charged him to become a great nation. So he needed to protect himself. So he did what he thought was right. So he wasn't rebelling, he wasn't deceiving. There was no law that said thou shalt not lie. He was operating under his conscience. So there's a big difference there between why they work. But the problem is that if we look at things through the wrong covenant, we can get confused. So we have to know, what covenant are we looking at? So then what happens later on in the story? Then you have Abram and Lot, and they separate. They go their separate ways. Which way does Lot go? Lot goes east, right? And at the time, there wasn't the horrific reports yet, but we can say that if they're heading east, that's not a good sign if they're going to be heading east, right? And then we have wars between kings and rulers break out. and Lot in his area is under attack. So Abram creates an army based out of his family. So at this time, Abram's family and his household is very, very large. He's a very wealthy, very well off, lots of servants, lots of members of his household. And when we say members of his household, it's really, we're talking about slaves and relationships and things like that, things that are in the household. But he hasn't given birth to any descendants yet, doesn't have an heir yet. So he makes an army out of his household to defend Lot from reigning kings of the area. So then we get to this guy. Melchizedek. All right, so we're just following the story of the canon, right? So Genesis 12 is where it kind of begins. There's the foretelling that God is going to make a great nation out of them. It's a promise. So you have two kings come to meet with Abram. Melchizedek is the king of Salem, and then you have the king of Sodom come. So king of Sodom and king of Salem, they come to meet Abram, and what do they want to do? They want to bless him, right? Well, the way that Melchizedek blesses Abram is with a prayer. He just prays blessings over Abram. Now, we're going to learn a lot more about Melchizedek once we get to the New Covenant, okay? But there are some things that we can talk about when it comes to Melchizedek. So first of all, scholars and the word itself states that Melchizedek is not a name. Melchizedek is a title. All right? If you actually look at the original Hebrew and the original Greek, if we want to go forward into Hebrews 7, Melchizedek is not stated that it's a name. It's a title, and it stands for priest of righteousness. I butchered that, but that's righteousness. So Melchizedek is a priest. Is it right? Did I spell that right? Okay. It's sloppy. Priest of righteousness. It's not a name, but it's a title. And we know that, looking forward, that the writer of Hebrews states that Jesus was a priest in the order of Melchizedek. Interesting to note that if Melchizedek is the priest of righteousness and the ruler over Salem, Salem would eventually become Jerusalem. And if Jesus is a priest in the order of Melchizedek, starting in Jerusalem, you start to see some of these types and shadows start to creep into the picture. And it's really wonderful foreshadowing to see some of these things take place. And then how does Abram respond? Well, this is before the law. So Melchizedek blesses Abram, and the response was that Abram tithes. He gives a tenth of everything that he has to Melchizedek. No law, but first example of a tithe. We can talk about that for hours and hours and hours. We're not. But this is important to put into your mind about how does a man of faith, how does a woman of faith honor the priest of righteousness? He did it with a tithe. So we can just let that sink in, and you can recognize how Abram was regarded as a man of faith because of the way he acted. He wasn't told to do this, but this is what he did. So we'll leave that as it is. First tithe in Scripture. Now, king of Sodom wanted to give all kinds of gifts, all kinds of rewards, plunder, all kinds of things to Abram. And Abram rejected Sodom's gift. So Abram, he rejects Sodom's gift, the king of Sodom. So why did he get it? It does reject it. We don't know why specifically. There's many different sermons that we can give as to why, but we can understand that receiving something from another puts you into a form of a covenant. Knowing what we know about what happened in Sodom, it's possible that Abram didn't want to get tied in with some things that were going on with the king of Sodom. Now that's just conjecture. Yeah, exactly. We're postulating that theory. It's not proven, but we could go there if we really wanted to. But we do know that in chapter 15, and we're not going to read the whole thing, but in chapter 15, God supports Abram's actions and basically says that God will be his reward and God will be his protector. So he doesn't need to rely on kings. He doesn't need to rely on the wealth through a covenant relationship with another man. You can rely on God. So once again, faith is being stirred and God is rewarding him and God is speaking to him in such a profound way. It's a really wonderful story. So no dependence on kings, total dependence on God as his covenant partner. All right? Really, really cool.
And Chris, in fact, Melchizedek, in effect, served him the first communion.
Yeah. Yeah, he did. You're right. We didn't read it, but
Like spiritual blessing.
right, broke bread and I'm sure we could get a lot of stuff out of that too. All right, you want to take a picture of this? And I'll probably leave it. I'll just flip it for now, but that way we don't forget later. Because we're going to get into some interesting things about the cutting covenant. So if you want to put a little header on your notes, if you're taking notes, the next part is the cutting covenant. All right. All right. So we have this thing called a cutting covenant. All right. Now this cutting covenant is an interesting situation. So after God in chapter 15 tells and reinforces the covenant that he had promised, that he was going to be his protector and that he was going to be his reward, and Abram knows in the back of his mind, you promised that I was going to be a great nation. Well, he points out the fact, how can I be a great nation if I have no heir? He even says, is my master steward going to be my heir? You know, or is there some other part here that I'm missing? So God doesn't despise him at that point, which is awesome. You know, that we can look at God and say, you promised me something and you haven't delivered. Right? As I was saying earlier, as a young kid, I walked the streets and I literally used nasty words and I cursed God. I think God's a pretty big boy and he can handle us speaking in frustration. All right? So I just want to put out there right now, I'm not advocating cursing, but I'm also going to say he understands your humanity and he understands your pain. So, you know, he was not despising Abram when Abram said, he said I was going to be a great nation, but I have no heirs. What's the deal? So he answered him with hope. So if we look at Genesis 15, 4 through 6, it says, then the word of the Lord came to him. This man will not be your heir. He's talking about Eleazar of Damascus, his slave. He says, this man will not be your heir, but a son is coming from your own body. He will be your heir. And then he took him outside and said, look up at the heavens and count the stars. If indeed you can count the stars, if indeed you can count them, then he said to him, so shall your offspring be. So Abram believed the Lord, and he credited it to him as righteousness. His righteousness did not come from the law. There was no law. His righteousness came through faith. So then God begins to lay out commands for this cutting covenant. So he basically tells Abram to cut certain animals in half, right? Slaughter these animals. Some of them he says not to slaughter. This is a very bloody, ritualistic covenant that was about to take place. This is where we see God establish the covenant that he made the promise to back in chapter 12. So we have these animals that he's commanded to cut. Bloody, blah, blah, gross. And what does Abram do? Abram spends all night fighting off the birds of prey that are trying to come down and eat the carcasses. It probably smelled gross. You have all of these things, and that's what Abram did. He's doing all of these things, trying to keep them away. All right? But, and he commanded that these animals be cut this way so that there would be a pathway. Right? So these are arrows, but that's the pathway that you could walk in between the two things. Now, in a dream, Abram falls asleep and he has a dream, and in this dream, God gives a prophetic word again about the descendants. And this time, it's not only does he have a large amount of descendants, but in this prophetic dream, he starts prophetically telling him that your descendants are going to go into Egypt, and then they're going to be slaves for a long period of time. But then afterwards, I'm going to punish the rulers in Egypt for what they are doing to your descendants. So there's a lot of prophetic words that are being given to Abram about what's going to happen in the future. And in Genesis 15, before that, so we get this picture, and what ends up happening is we're going to put Abram is, he's over here, and he's got his hands there. He's like sleeping away. All right, so there's Abram sleeping. And while Abram is sleeping, God comes down in a torch of fire, and he walks in between the carcasses. He walks in between the pathway. Now, this is really important to picture, because here's the thing. When we begin looking at things through cultural context, okay, this type of cutting covenant was common. It was standard. So when two nations or two kings or two men would enter into a cutting covenant, basically what they were saying is, as I walk through these animals that are cut and bled and dying, let it be done to me if I don't fulfill my obligations as has been done to these animals. You're making a declaration, you're making an oath. If I don't fulfill my obligations to this covenant, let it be done to me. Now, both parties would go through that pathway. In this situation, who went through the pathway? What did Abram do? He slept. Now, first of all, God obviously is not going to be slain if he didn't fulfill his part. But God in his sovereignty is going to fulfill his part anyways. However, it's a good understanding to know that God was saying, I'm going to go through here and I'm going to fulfill my part of the covenant. Abram, you don't have to do anything. And that, I can get rid of Abram. I don't need him here. But that is where we need to understand what types of covenants actually existed. So we're going to do some more context here, all right? So in this type of covenant, we have what's called, there's three types. So the first type of covenant is called a grant covenant. A grant covenant is where you have two parties. You have a greater party and you have a lesser party. The greater party takes all the responsibilities and obligations upon themselves, and the lesser party only receives. There's nothing that the lesser party has to do. That is called a grant covenant. Now, these three covenants I'm going to discuss, if you want some wonderful, heavy academic reading, read this, Kinship by Covenant. This is by a Catholic author, Scott Hahn. This is going into detail about covenants in general. And just to let you know, from this point forward in this book, these are all his footnotes. All right. Not only that, but his introduction is that long. Usually an introduction is just like a page or two. That's just the introduction. And you get into words like Berit, which is a covenant, and Akada, which is talking about the sealing of covenants, all these wonderful Hebrew words. It's really good books. If you want to learn about context, if you want to learn a lot of things about Abraham specifically and all the covenants, I highly recommend it. But he goes into detail about these covenants. So this is all based on what was culturally normal in the ancient Near East. So if I ever say the ANE, I'm talking about the ancient Near East, the Middle East, Syria, Libya, all of those areas that we now know them as those nations. All right. The second covenant is called a kinship covenant. Now, a kinship covenant is probably something that you're pretty familiar with. Kinship covenant is when you have two equal parties come together. Kind of like a marriage. Marriage covenant is a kinship covenant. Two equal parties come together, and each party has a small list of obligations evenly divided. Sometimes it's also called a parity. So I'm just going to put this up here as parity. But it's more commonly known as a kinship covenant. So you have mutually agreed upon obligations of what the two parties would do. And the third one is called a vassal covenant. And this covenant could also be called a suzerain. A suzerain covenant. Now, this is not a good covenant. These are in order of great to no one wants one. Okay? So a vassal covenant is basically, again, you have a greater and a lesser. And the covenant is completely based on the greater's ability to destroy the lesser. But instead of destruction, safety is offered in exchange for taxes and tribute and slaves, kind of like when a king conquers a nation. It's also important to note that the lesser has no choice in the matter. They cannot say no. They have to say yes. You're going to see how the vassal covenant comes into picture when we get into the Mosaic covenant, because some things happen that see some nodding of heads like I'm foreseeing what we're going here, but it's even more than you might think. So now, here's what's interesting. The first two covenants that we're talking about, last week the Noahic, this week the Abrahamic, they are both grant covenants. Why? Well, Abram or Noah was told that God was never going to destroy the earth with a flood, and that the sign of the promise was going to be a rainbow. What did Noah have to do? Nothing. God never said, I promise I will never flood the earth if. There were no stipulations. Now there was a charge, now go and multiply. but that was not directly connected to the conditions of the covenant. Abram was told, I'm going to make you a great nation, and I'm going to make your name great. There's no if. There is no if. It's, I'm going to do this. Reckoned by faith. Grant covenant is being used there. And Hebrews 6:13 has some interesting thoughts on this. So let's go to Hebrews 6:13 real quick. Hebrews, James, Peter, John. Anybody use like a song to find the books in the Bible? I do. I had to learn that when I was in Bible school. It's kind of funny. 6:13. When God made his promise to Abraham, since there was no one greater for him to swear by, he swore by himself, saying, I will surely bless you and give you many descendants. So God swore by himself. There was no other party involved. It was just God deciding that he was going to do. All right? So we have this cutting covenant. This is where, in Genesis 15, this is where the covenant is first kind of laid out in a little bit more detail. So then we have, going along with the storyline, then we have Hagar and Ishmael, right? So, who is Hagar and who is Ishmael? Hagar was Abram's, well, really Sarah's handmaid, right? And since they hadn't had a kid yet, it's only important that Abram sires the descendant, right? This is a beautiful story when you think about it. Because, we'll talk about this a little bit later, but so Hagar ends up getting pregnant by Abram for Ishmael, and you have, this situation that takes place, and Hagar is being mistreated by Sarai, and God comes and visits and gives a promise to to Hagar, and basically says that you don't need to worry. Ishmael is going to be a great nation. Okay? Ishmael is Abram's descendant. He's not the descendant of the main promises, but he is still the descendant. All right? Now, I don't want to go into too much conjecture, but there's some interesting things that are going along in some scholars that talk about when certain covenants were established, and that the covenant or the promise to make a great nation, by not just great meaning everybody looks up to them, but great meaning large and vast and numerous. Some scholars say that portion of the promise applied to both Ishmael and Isaac. But the promise to make your name great, not the nation great, but the name great, and that through your name, your seed will bless the earth, that portion was exclusively for Isaac. So when you start talking about having a name be made great versus the size of your descendants, your nation being large and vast and great, starts to raise some questions about land. But I'm going to leave that. I'll just put that pin up there and you can muse on that on your own. So kind of do what pastor does on Sunday mornings and say, you can figure that one out later. So, okay. So then you get to the confirming of the covenant. All right, so I'm not going to go too much into Hagar, but the confirming of the covenant is basically taking place in Genesis 17. All right, so here's the thing. The canon of Abraham's covenant began all the way back in Genesis 12. In Genesis 17 is where God finally confirms the covenant. And this is where we have the covenant become established. Even back in Genesis 15, this was a part of the covenant, but it wasn't fully established until Genesis 17. Okay? So that just reinforces this concept that the canon is before, during, and beyond. So the canon encircles everything that's taken place. So Genesis 17 is where God confirms his covenant 13 years after this. Okay? And what does he deal with? Well, Abram is 99 years old. And if we were to outline this, we have this. You took all your pictures? Okay. Let me just get rid of this. All right. So first you have, if you want to look at your order, so here's how the covenant is set up. All right. So you have Genesis 12 has 5 promises. Now we said a covenant has a promise and then it has a sign. So this Genesis 12 is where we have the promises. So the promises are that Abram would be blessed. You have his name would be great. You have everyone who blesses will be blessed. You have everyone who curses will be cursed. And finally, you have his offspring, or we will put in parentheses, seed, will be a blessing to the world. Something for the whole world. All right. So this is just what took place in Genesis 12, where God said, here are the promises, but the covenant had not yet been ratified. All right? So then, in Genesis 15, God, we're going to just say, makes the covenant. In Genesis 17, God confirms the covenant. Now, it can be confusing because the way that the language looks, when you start saying, okay, well, Genesis 12, he talks about the promises and it's the covenant. And then over here in Genesis 15, he says he's making a covenant. And then over here in Genesis 17, he says, I will make a covenant with you. In our English language, it kind of looks like God made 3 covenants with Abram. But he didn't. If you look at the original Hebrew language, there is a inference that it's more of a, hey, I'm bringing this back up again, and I'm confirming with you what I already promised you that I was going to do. So we have those things taking place. So this covenant in Genesis 17, it's confirmed with a change in name. And introduction of the standard of circumcision. Now we could say standard. We can also say sign. Okay? So if in the Noahic covenant, the promise was no flood, no destruction. Sign is the rainbow. In the Abrahamic covenant, these are the promises. What is the sign of the promise? Circumcision. Now, what is more important in the Noahic covenant? Is it more important to see a rainbow, or is it more important to rest in the fact that there will never be a flood again? Okay. Now, if we were to go back 2,500 years or 2,000 years and ask a scholarly, religious, Jewish person, what is more important, circumcision or faith? They would put more weight on the sign than the promise. And that was the crux of Paul's arguing and debate with the Jewish leaders and even the early Christians as far as what is important and what is not important. Is it the sign of the promise or is it the promise itself? And is it the fulfillment of the promise that we celebrate and we rest in, or do we celebrate the sign of the promise? Which one has more weight? Which one has more important? You just put that into your little nugget there.
So the Jew always seeks a sign.
Ding, ding. Ding, ding, ding. Okay, and then in Genesis 22, we have the covenant is finalized with the test, Mount Moriah. All right, this is where everything ends up being finalized there. All right. We can take a segue here for a second as we continue the story. So this is just kind of like where we've led up to at this point. Now, we have Sodom and Gomorrah, right? We know that story. This is all, we're going back to Genesis 15 again. With Sodom and Gomorrah, remember the focus. What was the focus that Abram and God in their interaction with each other when, God came in and said that this is what he was going to do. The reports are coming in. And I'm going to go down and I'm going to see if the reports are as wicked as they do, as they're saying. And if they are, then I'm going to execute justice for the reports that I'm coming in because the reports are wicked. And they begin this dialogue. Well, what if we find what? What is it that Abram is asking? So many righteous people. How is righteousness defined? There is no law. It's based on the standard of conscience, right? So we have Abram is told that in 15:6 that he believed God and it was accredited him to righteousness. So where are those in Sodom that believe God? Where are those that recognize that God is God and that he's somebody to have a relationship with? So we know the story. He doesn't find the right number of people, and the angels encourage Lot and his wife and his daughters and family to, hurry and leave as quickly as possible because the city is going to be destroyed with sulfur and fire. And then we have the situation where Lot's wife, who we don't have a name, right? So we have Lot's wife is turned into a pillar of salt. Now, again, lots of different sermons, lots of different things about what would take place. Some archaeologists and whatnot would say that, when you have, sulfur coming down as fast as it possibly can, you can have somebody instantly turn into a fossilized, figure. Death instantly. We've seen that with Pompeii. You have all these type of things that can possibly happen. But, here's something that we can kind of think about, just using, again, some historical, contextual type of things. There was another covenant that people would make with each other, and it was called a covenant of salt. And there's a place in the word, I don't know if I wrote it down. Oh yeah, Numbers 18:19 talks about covenant of salt. So just look at that so that we can prove that it's there. Numbers, there we go. 18:19 says, whatever is set aside from the holy offering the Israelites present to the Lord, I give to you and your sons and daughters as your regular share. It is an everlasting covenant of salt before the Lord for both you and your offspring. But you never read that one before. And if you did, you probably glazed right over it and didn't say, what is a covenant of salt? What does that mean? History, culture, context. Here's a standard covenant of salt. So, Elijah, you and I, we come to a decision. We're going to have a covenant about whatever, right? It was very common for us to have a little pouch on our side. And what was inside that pouch was salt. And that salt was used for a variety of different reasons. But what you would do when we would enter into a covenant of salt, I would take some of my salt and I would put it in your pouch, and you would take some of your salt and you would put it in my pouch. And if we ever got to a point where we bickered and we wanted to absolve ourselves from the covenant, we would say, well, if you can reach into my bag of salt and grab your grains of salt, then you can be absolved from this covenant. Not going to happen. Right? Not going to happen. So we kind of chuckle and laugh. That's kind of a neat, funny story, but we don't understand that. We don't walk in that context, that culture. We just don't get it. So when you have a covenant made with somebody, it's possible, this is speculated, I think, by Dr. Welton, but he says that, and other scholars too have said that it's quite possibly, he lists in the book, there are 2 Jewish Targums that indicate that Lot's wife actually did have a particular name, and the name would be synonymous with somebody who grew up in Sodom. So it's possible that she had a connection, a deep interconnection with the people, the possessions, her belongings, her life, her whole world was entrenched in Sodom, and it's about to be destroyed, and she was unwilling to just quickly drop it and leave. There was that connection held her back. And, it's possible that if we have our selves too deeply connected with places that are destructive in our lives, that destruction can come and harm us too, which could be the reason why Abram didn't want to enter into a covenant with the king of Sodom, because he didn't want to have those connections. So just something to think about. Again, it's conjecture, it's history, it's some different writings that are not canon, but some of these writings are historically interesting to utilize. So it's interesting. Okay, so then we get to the birth of Isaac, right? I'm going to flip this over. I'm not going to erase it. You can get it in a little bit. But this one we can erase, yes? So then we have Isaac's born. Okay. We're doing really good on time here. I'm rushing through all this. All right. I didn't know if it was 2 S's or 2 A's. Are we good? Any questions? No? Is it too much? Is it? Okay. So, solid as a rock. So, in Genesis 20, this is kind of like before Isaac, but in Genesis 20, we have another similar story regarding Sarah now, because the names have been changed. So Abraham and Sarah. This time, there's a king by the name of Abimelech. And what is... you would think that he would have learned, right? But he lies again. And all kinds of things happen with Abimelech, and God basically says in Genesis 20 that Sarah is going to be the one that bears the promised son. And in a sense, he was saying, the promise comes through Abraham and Sarah, and that Ishmael is not the promised heir. Why? Because Ishmael did not come from Sarah. This speaks volumes to the way that God was trying to demonstrate equality between men and women, equality in covenant between a man and a wife. It's really big. It's a really big deal. He could have basically said, sure, Ishmael was your firstborn. Come from Abraham. Great. Could have said that. Could have done it. But no, there was something specific about this covenant that God was honoring and wanted to honor Sarah too. And we have to remember, there's a lot of stuff. I'm going to talk about Sarah in a minute, but remember, Sarah laughed, right? And she was called out on it. But we look at Sarah in a different way now. And this is just the first time that we see that God is saying a woman is important in this journey. Okay? And we just gloss over that. It's too important to gloss over. We need to make sure that we see those things. So, eventually Isaac is born, and then God tells him to circumcise him on the 8th day. Circumcision. 8th day. Why the 8th day? Anybody ever asked that? Anybody have any reasons? This is kind of an interesting... Oh, go ahead.
On the 8th day, the blood is the slowest in an infant or something like that.
Ding, ding, ding. You're exactly right. Apparently, it's something like there's not enough vitamin K in the blood during the first week of an infant's life, but on the 8th day, the levels of vitamin K are above 100%, and vitamin K is critical to clotting.
Because it comes from exposure to sun.
Exactly right. So he could have told him to circumcise right away, and he could have told him to wait later, but he did it on the 8th day. And it's interesting how science always defends the Bible. I love it when I see those kind of things. So perfect for healing properties. So now, Ishmael and Hagar are then eventually sent away, but God again still says that there's still a promise that Ishmael was going to be a great nation, father of a great nation, and that promise was fulfilled. So there were still some promises for Hagar. But then we have the sacrifice, right? So this is where we have the story that we all know. Now, here's something that, if we look at things from historical, contextual, hermeneutic, I'll say that over and over again. If we look at things through that hermeneutic, we have to ask ourselves, what did Abraham think when God said, take your son so that we can sacrifice him? Now, what are some of the thoughts that we think of for ourselves? Don't put yourself in Abram's, but like right now, if knowing what you know about God, how would you react if God said you need to sacrifice your child? We don't even want to talk about it, right? So let's not even go there. All right? I don't even want to go there. That's enough. That was enough time dwelling on that? No, we're not. But it messes us up, right? Here's the thing. If we look at it through Abraham's eyes, and we don't look at it through the eyes of the Mosaic law, we don't look at it through the eyes of the new covenant, okay? Knowing what we know about God and his goodness, if we look at it through Abraham's eyes, he doesn't know anything about this God. All he knows is that God has appeared to him in visions and in dreams and in word and in fire tunnels and all of these situations where God has protected him and God has defended him. But he also knows throughout the rest of the land and all of the different kingdoms, they all sacrificed their children to the gods. It was normal. It's not normal for us, but for Abraham, it's possible that he said, oh, yeah, I guess that's what gods do. So, I have faith that you're my covenant partner, right? So Genesis 22:1, God basically says it was a test for Abraham, does not say, it is my desire that you slay your son. He says it was going to be a test. So right there, that's our first clue. God is up to something that's different. Okay? In 22 verse 2, we can read 22:2, and just reading it on face value, not knowing anything about Hebrew, Genesis 22:2 says, the Lord God said, take your son, your only son Isaac, whom you love, and go to the region of Moriah. Sacrifice him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains I will tell you about. Seems pretty cut and dry. Seems like it's a command, okay? But scholars point out that there is a tone in the original language that is more of an imploring request, not a direct command. So if we were to, even when we study English, we learn about all different types of, verbs. And we learn about, I'm not even an English major, but there's all kinds of different words we use to describe, is it imperative? Is it, you're the writer. So there's all kinds of different ways that a verb has its tense or its action, or I don't even know what words to use to describe it. What's that? Imperative is good. All right. Yeah, me. So it could possibly, in the ears of a Hebrew person or somebody who understands Hebrew, could hear it more of as, Abraham, will you take your son up to Mount Moriah, and I will show you where to sacrifice your son. Will you please do this for me? So it seems to be more of a request, not a command, but a request. Again, it's a test. He's asking, not a command, but a request. He is testing Abraham's faith through this entire process. So, as a man of faith, despite this being a hard decision, Abraham decides to trust his covenant partner. Now, Abraham has seen God do all kinds of crazy things. He's never seen anybody raised from the dead before. There's no indication in the Bible that anybody has been raised from the dead before. But is it possible to speculate that Abraham, as a man of faith, would trust his covenant partner who said, that son will be the one where your descendants come from? So despite being asked to do something, Abraham still had faith. Faith for what? We don't know. But Abraham was just going to go with the flow and see what happens. All right? So, as far as whether or not he would believe that God would resurrect Isaac, well, Genesis 22:5 says, he said to his servant, stay here with the donkey while I and the boy go over there. We will worship, and then we will come back. So he's been told to sacrifice his son, but he tells his servant, we're going to come back. So either he's lying to his servant to save face, or he's believing something, okay? And then we can also go to Hebrews 11:19. So if we go to Hebrews 11:19, it says, even though God had said to him, it is through Isaac that your offspring will be reckoned, Abraham reasoned that God would raise the dead. And figuratively speaking, he did receive Isaac back from the dead. The writer of Hebrews states that that is what Abraham believed. So, Abraham went with the flow. Now, here's what's important. So you have the story. You have them go up to the mountain. Isaac even says, where is the offering? And Abraham says, God will provide the offering. And he tells the boy to make the altar. And then he places the boy onto the altar. And he raises the knife. And right as he's about to plunge the knife into his son, God says, no. At that moment, God is stating to Abraham, I am not like those other gods. I'm not like them. Stop. You've basically passed the test, but no, I'm not like those other gods. This test was for you to go tell the nations who I am. I am not a God that demands sacrifice. And then the story moves on from there. It is huge revelation of this God that we have. And then Genesis 22:16-18 is the final confirmation. So 22:16-18, he says, I swear by myself, declares the Lord, that because you have done this and have not withheld your son, your only son, I will surely bless you and make your descendants as numerous as the stars in the sky and as the sands on the seashore. Your descendants will take possession of the cities of their enemies, and through your offspring, all nations on earth will be blessed because you have obeyed me. And you can also use seed instead of the word offspring there. All right? So this Genesis 22, this is where, it's finally confirmed. It's been established beforehand, but this is the last time God mentions it, and this is where he confirms that covenant.
Now, there's also some study on Isaac, that he wasn't like a little boy.
Mm-hmm.
He was like a youth.
Right?
Like he could have gotten off the altar.
Sure.
He could have fought it. He could have, so, Isaac was trusting Abraham, who was trusting God.
Yeah.
He was able to carry enough wood to burn.
Yeah, he built it. You think Cody would stay on that altar?
No.
So I want to return for a second because the Genesis kind of ends with Sarah. So let's finish up here with the significance of Sarah, okay? So just some interesting things. Again, if we're doing a Old Testament survey, here's some interesting facts. So it says, in Genesis 22, or 23 rather, talks about the death of Sarah, and says that Sarah lived 127 years old. Okay? I want to go back for a second. This is kind of like a footnote. Back before the flood, Genesis 6:3, God declares that the lifespan of humans was going to be 120 years old. So a lot of people use that to say that's the point where God said man will not live any longer than 120 years old. And if you don't believe in God, if you don't believe the Bible, you can use that to criticize the Bible, because God said at one point they won't live longer than 120, and you have countless examples after the flood of people living longer than 120 years. However, I can't go into too much to prove it. If you have the book, and by the way, pass this back all the way to her. She wanted to take a look at that before we leave. He goes into some details, but better translation is to say that God is declaring that there is 120 years left for mankind. Their days are numbered. 120 years left before I will destroy them via the flood. Sarah lives 120. I just say that because here Sarah lives 127 years old. All right? Not only is that beyond 120 years, but it's interesting to the fact this is the only biblical record that states how old a woman lived. There are no more that talk about it. So let's talk about Sarah for a second. The promised son had to come through Abraham and Sarah. I talked about it showing God's desire for equality between men and women, right? So there's an evidence of equality is demonstrated. All right? What else do we know? We know that in Galatians 4, if you want to read that chapter, it talks about how Sarah was used as a type. Sarah is a type of new covenant. Now, anytime you take a story and say this is a type or a foreshadow of the new covenant, it's a big deal. It's even a bigger deal when you go to an individual and say they are a type of the new covenant. It's a lot of honor. That's a lot of respect. Bam, Galatians 4, it's about Sarah. The author of Hebrews, in Hebrews 11, says that Sarah is listed with other heroes of the faith. So she's one of the few women that's listed as the heroes of the faith. And then 1 Peter 3. Let's look at that. 1 Peter 3. Hebrews, James, Peter, John. Oh, wait a minute. 1 Peter what? Oh, that's the whole chapter. I thought it was in a specific verse. Talking about wives and husbands, but she is used as a, I'm not going to read the whole chapter, but she admonishes women to imitate Sarah. All right? Imitate Sarah. Women should imitate Sarah. So this is what I want you to do. Instead of remembering Sarah as the one who laughed at God, I want you to remember Sarah's significance as a representation of equality. The promised covenant, promises of the covenant had to come through Sarah. And she was a type of the new covenant. She was listed among the heroes of the faith. And she was somebody that women should make an example out of for their life. Think of that when you think of Sarah. Don't think of her as one who just laughed. Because I'm sure we've all laughed. Right? So let's not do that. So this whole covenant, this Abrahamic covenant, Abrahamic covenant. This is a covenant of faith. Okay? As a covenant of faith, the entire book of Romans stresses how important this covenant of faith was and that the role that faith has in the new covenant. You could say that the Abrahamic covenant in general and the role that Abraham played is the closest thing that we have in the former covenants to what we have in the new covenant. Its promises, as we'll learn later, are fulfilled in the new covenant, but this is the closest thing we have. The one that comes after this, which we'll begin diving into next week, is the Mosaic covenant. And that covenant was night and day different. And in Hebrews 8:8-9, let's read it. So we've got a few more minutes here. we're ending real good because I'm done after this. Hebrews 8, 8-9 says, all right. Hebrews 8, verse 8-9. But God found fault with the people and said, the time is coming, declares the Lord, I will make a new covenant with the house of Israel and with the house of Judah. It will not be like the covenant I made with their forefathers when I took them by the hand to lead them out of Egypt, because they did not remain faithful to my covenant, and I turned away from them, declares the Lord. That covenant that I made with them when they came out of Egypt. He's talking about the Mosaic covenant. He's saying that the Mosaic covenant was not what we wanted. I'm going to do something better. It's going to be nothing like it. And this one is the one that the book of Romans goes back to. Before the law, Abraham walked in faith. They pointed back to Abraham and wanted to use Abraham as an example for their lifestyle. So this is interesting. This took a big chunk of history with the canon that's involved in it. But it's an important one. So when you remember this one, you want to remember that in the Abrahamic covenant, it had some two basic promises. I know that I listed like 5 of them over here. Okay? I'll go into this a lot later, but the 2 most important ones are here and here. That his name will be great. Obviously, his nation, he will be a great nation. His name will be great. And that his offspring, his seed, would be a blessing to the world. Those are the promises. Your name will be great, and your seed will be a blessing to the world. And what is the sign of the Abrahamic covenant? It's the circumcision. Yes, exactly. So that's it. That's covenant number 2. So next time we get together, it will be the Mosaic covenant. Class dismissed.